Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1853, a peculiar silence fell over the western slopes of the Ozark Mountains. The region, known for its dense forests and isolated communities, had always harbored secrets, but none as disturbing as what occurred at the Hale property, a remote homestead located approximately 17 miles from Springfield, Missouri. What began as a simple record of property ownership would eventually unravel into one of the most haunting cases ever documented in the region. The case wasn't just about a man they called Beast. It was about what humans are capable of when isolation becomes a prison and silence becomes an accomplice. The Hale property sat nestled between two ridges, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that became virtually impassable during the heavy rains. Richard Hale, a 47-year-old former merchant from Baltimore, had purchased the 160-acre property in 1848, according to land registry documents archived in the Springfield County Records Office. The documents, yellowed and fragile after decades in storage, show that Hale paid what was considered a substantial sum at the time. What made this purchase unusual was that Hale had never visited the property before buying it, relying solely on descriptions from a cousin who had ventured west years earlier. According to tax records from 1849 to 1852, Hale listed himself as the sole occupant of the property. No family members were mentioned, no wife, no children, just a lone man living in a region where isolation itself could be a form of slow death. Neighbors, though few and far between in those parts, would later tell investigators that Hale rarely ventured into town, perhaps once every 2 or 3 months for supplies. When he did, he spoke little, handled his business efficiently, and returned to his mountain property before nightfall. Those who encountered him described him as educated in speech but weathered in appearance, with eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you, according to a statement given by James Miller, the general store owner in Springfield. What the official records didn't show, what would only come to light years later, was that Hale was not alone on that mountain property. According to a journal discovered during the renovations of the old Springfield courthouse in 1964, Hale had brought with him a slave from Maryland. The slave's name, according to the journal entries, was Moses Green. The journal, written by a court clerk named Samuel Wilson, mentioned that Green had been purchased by Hale in 1845, 3 years before their move west. Wilson's journal entries were brief, factual, with little elaboration. But one entry from October 1848 noted, "Our Hale departed west today, took with him provisions, tools, seeds, and his slave, M. Green. Curious business, as he tells no one of his intentions there." The relationship between Hale and Green would have remained obscure, lost to history like so many other untold stories of that era, if not for what happened in the winter of 1853. What made this case particularly disturbing wasn't just what occurred, but how the community responded, with a silence that was both deliberate and devastating. The Ozarks in 1853 were still largely untamed. The forests were thick, the winters harsh. Survival required preparation, knowledge, and community support when times grew difficult. For those living in isolation, winter could be a death sentence if proper preparations hadn't been made. According to meteorological records preserved by the Army Corps stationed in Jefferson City, the winter of 1853 was particularly severe. Snow fell as early as October, and temperatures dropped well below what was typical for the region. For the residents scattered throughout the mountains, this meant hunkering down, relying on stored food and firewood until spring thawed the frozen landscape. For Richard Hale and Moses Green, that winter would be their last together on the mountain. By spring, one would be dead, and the other changed forever by what transpired in that remote cabin. The events that would later come to light began unfolding in late November, when the first heavy snow blanketed the Ozarks. According to later testimony, Richard Hale had sustained an injury earlier that fall while clearing timber from the northern section of his property. A tree had fallen unpredictably, crushing Hale's right leg below the knee. Under normal circumstances, such an injury would have necessitated immediate medical attention, perhaps even amputation. But the nearest doctor was in Springfield, a journey impossible to make with such an injury and increasingly treacherous as winter approached. It was at this point that the dynamic between Hale and Green began to shift. According to an account later provided by Ezekiel Thompson, a trapper who occasionally traded with Hale, he visited the property in early December and found Hale bedridden, his leg badly infected. The smell in that cabin, Thompson later told authorities, was something I won't ever forget, like death already had a grip on him. What surprised Thompson more than Hale's condition was the behavior of Green. The colored man wasn't acting like any slave I'd ever seen. He was giving Hale instructions, telling him he needed to drink a tea he'd made, checking the wound like he was the master there. This inversion of roles apparently disturbed Thompson enough that he mentioned it to a few people in Springfield when he next visited. According to courthouse records, Thompson told the sheriff that something wasn't right up at the Hale place. But with winter fully set in and no crime apparent, no action was taken. What happened over the following weeks would be pieced together later from multiple sources. Hale's own journal, recovered from the property, letters Hale had written but never sent, and perhaps most significantly, the testimony of Moses Green himself, though how reliable that testimony was, would become a matter of considerable debate. Hale's journal, water-damaged but partially legible, painted a picture of a man in agony, both physical and psychological. The handwriting deteriorated as the entries progressed, suggesting his condition was worsening. An entry from December 12th read, "Fever worsens. G says the poultice is drawing out infection, but pain is unbearable. He watches me constantly now." Another entry, dated December 20th, was more disturbing. "G refuses to help me write letters for help, says past too dangerous now. I believe he wants me to die here." As Hale's condition deteriorated, Moses Green assumed more control over their shared environment. According to what Green would later tell authorities, he was simply trying to keep them both alive through the winter. The pass to Springfield was indeed blocked by snow, and leaving Hale alone while he went for help would have meant certain death for the injured man. But Hale's journal suggested a different narrative, one where Green was deliberately prolonging his suffering, extracting a slow revenge for years of enslavement. The turning point came in January, when Hale's infection reached a critical stage. According to Green's later testimony, he realized that without intervention, Hale would certainly die. It was at this point that Green made a decision that would later be seen as either an act of extraordinary mercy or calculated cruelty, depending on who was interpreting events. Using knowledge he claimed to have gained from an elderly woman in Maryland who had practiced medicine among the slave population, Green determined that Hale's lower leg needed to be amputated. With no proper medical tools, Green improvised. He crafted a tourniquet from leather straps, fashioned a saw from a modified kitchen knife, and distilled a primitive anesthetic from herbs he had gathered and dried the previous summer. What followed was described in clinical detail in a statement Green provided in the spring. "I gave him the drink to dull his senses. I bound his upper leg tight with the leather to slow the bleeding. I told him what needed doing, and though he cursed me and called me things I won't repeat, he knew as well as I did that it was his only chance. I heated the knife blade in the fire until it glowed red. Then I did what needed doing. The amputation performed by a man with no formal medical training in a remote cabin during the dead of winter, should by all rights have killed Richard Hale. That it didn't was remarkable enough to later draw the attention of medical professionals as far away as St. Louis, who requested details of Green's procedure. Green's careful cauterization of blood vessels, his use of herbal compresses to prevent infection, and his rigorous cleaning of the wound site showed knowledge that went far beyond what would have been expected. For the remainder of the winter, Hale was entirely dependent on Green for survival. Unable to move about the cabin without assistance, he could not feed himself, tend the fire, or perform any of the necessary tasks to survive the harsh mountain winter. According to Green's account, it was during this period of enforced intimacy that their relationship underwent its most profound transformation. For the first time, Green later stated, he had to see me as a man, not as property. Every bite of food, every sip of water, every moment of warmth came from my hands. And I could have walked away any time and left him to die. Hale's journal entries from this period are sporadic, suggesting he was often too weak or medicated to write. But those that exist show a man grappling with a fundamental shift in his understanding of his relationship with Green. One entry from February simply stated, "I have never thanked him, not once in 8 years. Today I did." By March, the snow had begun to recede, making the pass to Springfield navigable again. It was at this point that the final act of this disturbing drama began to unfold. According to multiple sources, including the Springfield Weekly Register dated March 17, 1854, Moses Green appeared in town leading a mule-drawn cart with a weakened but alive Richard Hale. Their appearance caused immediate sensation, not just because of Hale's missing limb, but because of the obvious shift in dynamic between the two men. Green was not behaving as a slave, and Hale was not treating him as one. The local doctor, William Crawford, examined Hale and declared the amputation as skillfully done as any I've seen performed by trained surgeons. Crawford's medical notes, preserved in the Springfield Historical Society archives, express particular amazement at the prosthetic leg Green had fashioned for Hale. Crafted from seasoned oak with a complex joint mechanism that allowed for remarkably natural movement, the prosthetic was described by Crawford as an invention of significant medical value, showing mechanical genius I wouldn't have thought possible from an untrained mind. It was this prosthetic leg that would ultimately transform both men's lives, though not in ways either could have anticipated. News of the remarkable medical procedure and innovative prosthetic spread quickly. By April, a journalist from St. Louis had traveled to Springfield to interview both men. The resulting article, published in the St. Louis Gazette on April 23, 1854, described Green as a natural genius whose skills in medicine and mechanics have been hidden behind the cruel veil of servitude. The article noted that several doctors had expressed interest in learning Green's techniques for amputation and prosthetic design. What the article didn't mention, what wouldn't come to light until documents were discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1965, was the complex legal situation that was unfolding behind the scenes. According to court records, Richard Hale did something unprecedented in that region and era. He filed papers to free Moses Green. The manumission documents, dated May 12, 1854, stated, "I hereby relinquish all claim and ownership of the man Moses Green, acknowledging his full freedom and right to the fruits of his own labor." What made these documents particularly unusual was an addendum in which Hale assigned Green partial ownership of the mountain property and full rights to any proceeds from his prosthetic design. This legal arrangement was radical enough to cause significant controversy in pre-Civil War Missouri. According to letters between the Springfield magistrate and higher courts in Jefferson City, there was considerable debate about whether such a transfer of property to a freed slave could be legally recognized. While Missouri was technically a slave state, the remote Ozark region had relatively few large slave owners compared to the plantation regions elsewhere in the South. Still, the precedent of recognizing a former slave as a business partner of a white man was troubling to many authorities. What happened next reveals the darkest aspects of this case, the community response that transformed a story of unlikely redemption into one of horror. On June 3, 1854, a group of men from Springfield and the surrounding areas rode to the Hale property. According to witness statements given years later, the group consisted of between 7 and 10 men, including at least 2 prominent business owners and a cousin of the county sheriff. Their stated purpose, according to their own later testimony, was to investigate rumors of improper relations between Hale and his former slave. What exactly occurred at the property that day has never been fully established. Richard Hale was found dead the next morning by Ezekiel Thompson, who had come to trade for furs. Hale's body showed signs of severe beating. Moses Green was missing, as were all prototypes of the prosthetic leg and the notebooks containing his designs. The official investigation, such as it was, concluded quickly. The sheriff's report, a mere 2 paragraphs, stated that Richard Hale, having previously suffered the loss of a limb, likely fell and suffered fatal injuries during a theft at his property. His former slave, Moses Green, is sought for questioning regarding the theft and possible involvement in Hale's death. This narrative, that Green had murdered his former master and fled with his invention, became the accepted truth in the region. A bounty was posted for Green's capture, and notices were sent to neighboring counties describing him as dangerous and ungrateful. The notices made special mention of Green's height and build, referring to him as the one they called Beast on account of his size and strength. The reality, as documents discovered nearly a century later would suggest, was far different. In 1967, during the demolition of an abandoned warehouse in St. Louis, workers discovered a hidden compartment containing a leather satchel. Inside were papers belonging to Moses Green, including journal entries, technical drawings of prosthetic designs, and letters never sent. These documents, now housed in the Missouri Historical Society, tell a very different version of what happened after Richard Hale's death. According to Green's journal, he had been warned by Ezekiel Thompson that men from town were planning to visit the property. Sensing danger, Green had hidden in the forest when they arrived. From his vantage point, he witnessed the men confronting Hale, demanding to know where Green and the prosthetic designs were. When Hale refused to answer, they began to beat him. Green, outnumbered and aware that intervention would likely result in both their deaths, remained hidden until the men left. Upon returning to the cabin and finding Hale barely alive, Green tried to render medical aid. According to his journal entry dated June 3rd, I tried everything I knew, applied compresses to the bleeding, set his broken arm, but the damage inside was too great. He died before dawn, calling for water. I couldn't get into him fast enough. His last words were to tell me to run, that they would surely return. Taking only essential supplies, the prosthetic designs, and what little money Hale had kept in the cabin, Green fled north. His journal entries for the following weeks describe a harrowing journey, traveling by night, hiding during the day, constantly fearing capture. Eventually, he made his way to St. Louis, where he found shelter with a community of free black dock workers. It was in St. Louis that Green attempted to find a manufacturer for his prosthetic design. His journal describes meetings with several medical equipment suppliers, all of whom expressed initial interest in his design until they learned the inventor was black. One entry from August 1854 reads, "Third rejection this week. Mr. Harrison examined the drawings for nearly an hour, called them revolutionary and brilliant. then asked when he could meet the white doctor who created them. When I explained they were my designs, his demeanor changed entirely. Said he couldn't possibly do business with me. Frustrated by these rejections and increasingly concerned about being recognized and returned to Missouri as a fugitive, Green eventually connected with an abolitionist doctor named Franklin Pierce, no relation to the president. According to correspondence found in the leather satchel, Pierce recognized the value of Green's designs and offered to present them as his own, with an agreement to share any profits. Green's last journal entry, dated October 12, 1854, reads, "Dr. Pierce leaves for Boston tomorrow with my drawings and a prototype. He promises fair treatment and to send for me once established there. I have no choice but to trust him. My funds dwindle, and staying in one place grows more dangerous by the day. The irony doesn't escape me that the very invention meant to give a man mobility might finally allow me my freedom, though I see none of the credit for it." What happened to Moses Green after this point remains unclear. No further journals or letters from him have ever been found. Records from the Massachusetts Medical Equipment Company, established in 1855, show that Dr. Franklin Pierce registered a patent for a revolutionary articulated prosthetic limb that bears striking resemblance to Green's designs. The company became quite successful, with Pierce becoming wealthy from government contracts to provide prosthetics to veterans after the Civil War. No record exists of Green ever receiving payment or acknowledgement. Back in the Ozarks, the story of Richard Hale's murder by his former slave became local legend. Embellished over time, the tale transformed Moses Green from a skilled craftsman and healer into a monstrous figure, the Beast of Hale Mountain, who had manipulated his master and then killed him out of pure malice. This narrative persisted for generations, appearing in local histories and folklore collections well into the 20th century. The truth that a remarkable partnership had formed between these two men, that one had saved the other's life through skill and determination, that together they had created something of genuine value, and that this potential had been destroyed by the prejudice of their time, remained buried for over a century. In 1969, historian Margaret Wilson published a comprehensive examination of the case titled "The Beast That Never Was: Invention and Injustice in the Ozarks." Using the discovered documents, Wilson meticulously reconstructed the events of 1853 and 1854, challenging the entrenched narrative. Her work faced considerable resistance from local historical societies, many of whom refused to acknowledge this revised history. The Hale property itself has long since returned to wilderness. No structure remains of the cabin where these events unfolded. In 1972, a small marker was placed approximately where the property was believed to have been, reading simply, "Site of the Hale Green Homestead, 1848 to 1854. Let truth prevail over legend." Few visitors ever see this marker, hidden as it is by the dense Ozark forest that has reclaimed the land. Those who make the difficult journey report an unusual heaviness to the air, a silence more profound than seems natural. Perhaps it's merely suggestion, the power of knowing what transpired there. Or perhaps it's something more, the lingering echo of a truth suppressed, of innovation stifled, of justice denied. The prosthetic leg designed by Moses Green, or rather the version patented by Dr. Pierce, would eventually evolve into designs still referenced in modern prosthetics. The articulated joint system, described in Pierce's patent applications as allowing natural movement closely approximating that of the human limb, established principles that would influence the field for decades to come. None of these advancements credit Moses Green. In 2011, a graduate student at Washington University discovered correspondence between Dr. Pierce and a colleague that explicitly acknowledged Green as the true inventor. The letter, dated 1867, states, "The clever joint mechanism was entirely the creation of the Negro green. I have merely refined what was already an ingenious design." This discovery prompted calls for historical recognition of Green's contribution to medical science, though such efforts remain largely academic. The men who rode to the Hale property that fateful day in June 1854 were never charged with any crime. Most lived out their lives in and around Springfield, prosperous and respected community members. According to town records, one eventually became mayor. Another served as a deacon in the local church for over 30 years. Their descendants still live in the region, most likely unaware of their ancestors' involvement in this dark chapter of local history. The story of Moses Green and Richard Hale stands as a haunting reminder of how easily truth can be buried, how convenient narratives can replace inconvenient realities, and how history is often written not by those who lived it, but by those who survived to tell the tale. The invention that should have changed everything ultimately changed nothing, at least not for the man who created it. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Ozarks, on a mountain slope where a cabin once stood, the echoes of what happened there continue to resonate, audible only to those willing to listen past the comfortable legends to the uncomfortable truth. There are those who say that on particularly cold winter nights, when the wind blows just right through the valleys of the western Ozarks, you can hear something that sounds almost like metal striking wood, rhythmic, deliberate, like someone crafting something with patient determination, the sound of an invention that was stolen along with the life and legacy of the man who created it, an invention that should have changed everything. In the archives of the Springfield Historical Society, among the thousands of documents cataloguing the region's past, there is a small, easily overlooked folder labeled simply Hale Property, 1853. Inside is a single page, a sketch drawn by Dr. William Crawford after examining the prosthetic limb Green had created. At the bottom, in faded ink, Crawford wrote, "I have seen the future of medical science, designed by hands society would deem incapable. God help us for what we waste through our blindness. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire case is not what happened on that remote mountain property, but how easily the truth was rewritten, how thoroughly a man's life and contributions could be erased, replaced with a monstrous caricature that served the needs of those who created it. The true beast in this story was not Moses Green, but the society that refused to see him as anything more than what they had already decided he was. Today, the name Moses Green appears in no medical textbooks. His innovations are attributed to others. His story, even when told, is often presented as a curious footnote rather than the profound injustice it represents. The silent complicity that allowed his erasure continues in this omission, an echo of the original crime that has never fully faded. In the spring of 1973, an elderly man visited the marker on the old Hale property. According to the forest ranger who guided him there, the man stood silently for nearly an hour, then placed a small wooden object at the base of the marker before departing. The ranger later described the object as a miniature carving of what looked like part of a leg, carved from dark wood with tiny metal joints that actually moved. The visitor refused to give his name, saying only that he was paying a debt owed by his family. By the time historians learned of this visit and attempted to locate the man, he had disappeared, leaving behind only questions about what connection he might have had to the events of a century before. The wooden carving itself was collected by the ranger and eventually donated to the Springfield Historical Society, where it remains today, a small, tangible link to a story that continues to haunt those who learn the truth of what occurred in the Ozarks in 1853, when a man they called Beast created something that should have changed everything, but instead changed nothing at all. A man matching his description and approximate age appeared in the 1860 census for Philadelphia, listed as Moses Green, the dropped E, potentially deliberate, or a recording error. Occupation, mechanical craftsman. The same individual appears again in the 1870 census, this time with the occupation medical device designer. While impossible to confirm with absolute certainty that this was the same Moses Green from the Ozarks, the coincidence of name, age, and unusual occupation makes a compelling case. Researchers at the Missouri State Archives discovered in 1987 a series of census records that shed additional light on the fate of Moses Green. If this was indeed Moses Green, he apparently lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity in Philadelphia, never receiving recognition for his most significant innovation. According to city death records, this Moses Green died in 1876 of tuberculosis. The record notes that he was buried in an unmarked grave in a segregated cemetery that was later relocated during city expansion in the early 1900s. No descendants were listed. The historical neglect of Green's story represents more than just an oversight. It exemplifies the systematic erasure of black innovation and achievement that characterized American history well into the 20th century. As historian Dr. Elijah Montgomery noted in his 1992 analysis of the case, the transformation of Moses Green from brilliant innovator to monstrous beast in local folklore served a specific psychological purpose for the community that perpetuated this narrative. It justified their actions, absolved them of guilt, and reinforced the existing social order that would have been threatened by acknowledging Green's achievements. The Hale property remained abandoned for decades after the events of 1854. According to county records, taxes went unpaid, and the land eventually reverted to state ownership in 1872. Various attempts to sell or develop the property failed, with potential buyers reportedly being dissuaded by local rumors that the land was cursed or haunted. These superstitions, ironically, preserved the site from development that would have further obscured its historical significance. In 1934, during the Great Depression, a civilian conservation corps team was assigned to survey the area as part of a larger Ozark mapping project. Their field notes, preserved in the National Archives, include a curious entry dated July 7th. Located remains of old homestead approximately 17 miles west of Springfield. Stone foundation and chimney still visible. Unusual feature. Numerous deep carved markings in several trees surrounding the clearing, appearing to be detailed technical drawings. Local guide refused to remain on site overnight, citing persistent local superstition about the area. The referenced tree carvings were photographed as part of the survey, but were never fully analyzed or interpreted. The photographs, rediscovered during a digitization project in 2003, show what modern experts have identified as detailed cross-sectional diagrams of jointed mechanical systems, remarkably similar to the prosthetic design attributed to Dr. Pierce. These carvings, apparently made by someone with detailed knowledge of the original prosthetic design, suggest that Moses Green may have returned to the site at some point after Hale's death, perhaps to document his work in a form that could withstand time even if his papers were lost or destroyed. By 1940, the area had been incorporated into the Mark Twain National Forest, further protecting it from development. The stone foundation and chimney noted in the 1934 survey were gradually reclaimed by the forest. By the time Margaret Wilson attempted to locate them for her 1969 book, no visible structures remained. The legend of the Beast of Hale Mountain persisted in local folklore throughout the 20th century, taking on increasingly supernatural elements as it passed through generations. By the 1950s, The story had transformed into a cautionary tale told to children about a monstrous figure who haunted the western Ozarks, targeting those who ventured too far into the wilderness alone. The historical Moses Green and Richard Hale had been entirely subsumed by fiction. In 1995, Dr. Rebecca Carpenter, a medical historian specializing in 19th-century prosthetics, published a paper in the Journal of Medical History titled The Green Legacy: Reclaiming the Forgotten Pioneer of Modern Prosthetics. Carpenter's research connected the designs attributed to Dr. Pierce with the recovered documents of Moses Green, providing a detailed technical analysis that confirmed Green as the original inventor. Her paper concluded with a damning assessment. The medical establishment's failure to recognize Green's contributions represents one of the most significant and deliberate erasures of black achievement in medical science. Carpenter's work sparked renewed interest in the case, particularly among scholars of African American history and medical innovation. In 2007, a symposium at Howard University brought together historians, medical experts, and descendants of families from the Springfield area to discuss the Green-Hale case and its implications. The symposium produced a formal petition to the American Medical Association and various medical history museums, requesting official recognition of Moses Green's contributions to prosthetic development. As of the publication of this account, those petitions remain under consideration, caught in bureaucratic processes that mirror the historical reluctance to revise established narratives. The human cost of this historical erasure extends beyond Moses Green himself. According to documents discovered in 1998 in the archives of a Baltimore church, Green had a family in Maryland before being taken west by Richard Hale. A marriage certificate dated 1842 records the union of Moses Green and Sarah Johnson. Parish birth records indicate they had 2 children, a daughter, Mary, born in 1843, and a son, Thomas, born in 1845. There is no record of what happened to this family after Green was taken to the Ozarks, whether they were sold to different owners or remained in Maryland. The possibility that Green's medical and mechanical genius might have been passed to descendants who were never able to acknowledge their lineage represents yet another dimension of the loss inherent in this story. The complex relationship between Richard Hale and Moses Green continues to fascinate historians and ethicists. What began as the fundamentally unjust owner-slave dynamic evolved under extreme circumstances into something more complicated. Hale's decision to free Green and grant him property rights suggests a profound change in perspective, one that cost him his life when it challenged prevailing social norms. Yet, it would be a mistake to romanticize Hale as a hero in this narrative. As Dr. Montgomery noted in his analysis, Hale's awakening to Green's humanity, while significant, came only after years of participating in the slave system, and only when his own survival depended entirely on Green's skills and mercy. In 2014, ground-penetrating radar surveys of the approximate location of the Hale property revealed a small unmarked burial site approximately 50 yards from where the cabin would have stood. Ethical considerations and Forest Service regulations prevented excavation, but the size and orientation are consistent with burial practices of the period. Local historians speculate that this may be the final resting place of Richard Hale, buried by Moses Green before he fled north. The technical innovations in Green's prosthetic design represented a significant advance over other artificial limbs available in the mid-19th century. Most prosthetics of that era were crude devices with limited functionality, often causing pain and additional injury to the wearer. According to the technical drawings found among Green's papers, his design incorporated several revolutionary features. A cushioned socket that distributed weight more evenly, an articulated ankle that adjusted to uneven terrain, and a knee joint that locked and unlocked depending on whether weight was being applied. These features would not become standard in commercial prosthetics until the early 20th century, nearly 50 years after Green developed them. Even more remarkable was Green's integration of biomechanical principles that he had apparently deduced through observation and intuition without formal education. His notes include detailed observations about natural gait, weight distribution during walking, and the interaction between prosthetic components and the remaining natural limb. Dr. Carpenter's analysis concluded that Green had independently developed concepts that would not be formally articulated in medical literature until decades later. The question of how Green acquired this knowledge remains a subject of scholarly debate. His journals mention observing surgeons in Baltimore while serving as a household slave to a physician before being purchased by Hale. Other entries reference books he had read while learning to read secretly against the prohibitions typical of the time. But the leap from these limited exposures to the sophisticated understanding demonstrated in his designs suggests an exceptional mind that could synthesize observations into innovation. In August 2018, researchers from the Smithsonian Institution visited the Springfield Historical Society to examine the small wooden carving left at the memorial marker in 1973. Using advanced imaging techniques, they discovered a tiny inscription hidden inside the joint mechanism, visible only when the miniature leg was fully disassembled. The inscription, barely legible after decades, appeared to read MG designed TG. A carved, followed by a date that analysts interpreted as April 1872. This discovery sparked speculation that the elderly man who left the carving might have been Thomas Green, Moses Green's son, who would have been in his late 20s in 1872 when the carving was apparently made. If this interpretation is correct, it suggests that Moses Green may have reconnected with at least one of his children later in life, and that knowledge of his true contributions to medical science may have been preserved within his family, even as the broader historical record obscured them. The story of Moses Green and Richard Hale has been dramatized several times in recent years, including a 2009 independent film titled The Invention on the Mountain and a 2016 play called Beast No More that ran briefly off-Broadway. These artistic interpretations have helped introduce the case to broader audiences, though historians have criticized some adaptations for oversimplifying the complex historical and social contexts. In 2021, the Springfield Medical Center dedicated a new prosthetics research laboratory named in honor of Moses Green, representing the first institutional recognition of his contributions in the very region where his story began. The dedication ceremony was attended by medical professionals, historians, and representatives from several historically black colleges and universities. The laboratory's mission statement explicitly acknowledges the historical injustice of Green's erasure and commits to supporting research opportunities for underrepresented groups in medical technology. Archaeological interest in the Hale property site continues, though access remains restricted due to its location within protected forest land. Non-invasive surveys conducted in 2023 identified several potential artifact concentrations that could yield further information about the daily lives of Hale and Green during their time on the mountain. Archaeologists have proposed a limited excavation, arguing that the historical significance justifies careful intervention, but approval remains pending as of this account's publication. The transformation of Moses Green from skilled innovator to mythical monster in local folklore represents a particularly disturbing form of historical revision. The Beast of Hale Mountain became a flexible symbol onto which the community could project its fears and justify its actions. As the actual events receded in time, the legend grew more elaborate and less connected to the historical figures involved. By the mid-20th century, children in the Ozarks were being warned to behave, or the beast will get you. A cruel distortion of a man whose actual story represented intellect, resilience, and innovation in the face of oppression. The site marker, placed in 1972, has itself become part of the ongoing narrative. Visitors occasionally leave small tokens, coins, carved figures, handwritten notes, suggesting that for some, the location has taken on significance beyond its historical context. Forest rangers report periodically removing these items, though they maintain a photographic record that has become a unique archive of how the public continues to engage with this complex history. Education about the Green Hail case remains limited in Missouri public schools. A 2019 survey of state history curricula found that only 3 out of 174 school districts included substantial information about the case in their teaching materials. However, grassroots efforts, led by educators and community historians, have developed supplementary resources now used in several districts, particularly those with significant African American student populations. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the case lies in what it reveals about the construction and preservation of historical narratives. The original transformation of Green from healer and inventor to monster served specific social purposes for the community that created it. The subsequent rediscovery and re-examination of his actual contributions force a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about how history is written, whose stories are preserved, and whose achievements are recognized. The physical isolation of the Hale property, a remote mountain homestead, accessible only by a difficult path, serves as an apt metaphor for the isolation of the truth about what occurred there. Just as the dense Ozark forests gradually reclaimed the site of the cabin, obscuring its physical location, so too did deliberate misinformation and neglect obscure the historical reality of what transpired between these two men during that harsh winter of 1853. Modern visitors to the western Ozarks often pass within miles of where these events unfolded, unaware of the complex human drama that once played out among those hills. The region's beauty, its flowing streams, dense forests, and dramatic vistas, gives no hint of the darker history embedded in the landscape. This disconnect between picturesque setting and disturbing historical events creates a cognitive dissonance that mirrors the broader American struggle to reconcile natural beauty and opportunity with histories of injustice and violence. The true horror of the Green Hail story lies not in supernatural elements or graphic violence, but in the relentless human capacity to distort truth to serve prevailing narratives, to transform victims into villains, to erase achievement when acknowledging it would require uncomfortable reassessment of established hierarchies. The silencing of Moses Green's contribution was not a single act, but a prolonged process, perpetuated across generations, involving institutions as well as individuals. What makes this case particularly haunting is how easily it might have remained buried. If not for the chance discoveries of hidden documents, if not for the persistence of researchers unwilling to accept established narratives, if not for the gradual shifts in social consciousness that made reassessment possible, the transformation of Moses Green from brilliant innovator to monstrous beast might have become permanent, uncontested historical fact. In the silence of the Ozark forest, where wind moves through ancient trees and sunlight filters through dense canopy, something of this story remains, not as a supernatural presence, but as an echo of human potential thwarted, of innovation suppressed, of truth distorted. The horror lies not in what these woods might hide, but in what our collective memory has chosen to forget, and in the recognition that such erasures continue to shape our understanding of the past, and consequently, our present. For those who take the time to learn the true story of Moses Green and Richard Hale, the Western Ozarks never look quite the same again. Behind their serene beauty lies a reminder of how easily truth can be buried, how thoroughly a life can be misrepresented, and how long justice can be delayed. The most profound terror in this narrative is not what happened on that remote mountain property in 1853, but how completely the truth of it was obscured for over a century after. The question that haunts this case, that makes it relevant far beyond its specific historical context, is simple but profound. How many other Moses Greens have been written out of history? How many innovations, discoveries, and contributions have been attributed to others, or simply lost because they came from individuals society was unwilling to recognize? The answer to this question represents a form of horror more disturbing than any supernatural tale, the horror of systemic erasure and the incalculable loss it represents to human progress and understanding. In 2018, a graduate student researching the Green case discovered a brief newspaper obituary from 1876 in the Philadelphia Inquirer. The three-line notice stated simply, "Moses Green, aged 56, formerly of Maryland, passed on September 4th from consumption, a skilled craftsman who improved the lives of many." This modest acknowledgement, almost certainly referring to Moses Green, represents perhaps the only public recognition he received during his lifetime for his contributions. Its brevity and obscurity stand in stark contrast to the lengthy laudatory obituaries that would later memorialize Dr. Franklin Pierce, when he died in 1882, celebrated as a pioneering innovator in prosthetic design. Today, visitors to the Missouri History Museum in St. Louis can view a small exhibition dedicated to Moses Green, featuring reproductions of his technical drawings and journal entries, alongside a modern prosthetic leg whose design incorporates principles he pioneered. The exhibition text acknowledges that Green's story represents both exceptional individual achievement and the broader pattern of African-American contributions being systematically excluded from our historical understanding of American innovation and development. The forest has reclaimed much of what might have told us more about Moses Green and Richard Hale. The cabin where they spent that transformative winter is gone, returned to earth. The path that connected them to the wider world has disappeared beneath decades of fallen leaves and new growth. Even the marker placed in 1972 is difficult to locate without specific guidance. But some things remain. The technical principles Green developed continue to influence modern prosthetic design. The documents he created, against all odds and conventional expectations of his time, survive in archives and digital repositories. And the truth of what occurred in the Ozarks in 1853, though buried for generations, eventually emerged, a testament to the fact that while justice may be delayed, while recognition may come too late for those who earned it, the truth retains a stubborn persistence that can outlast even the most deliberate attempts to suppress it. As this account concludes, one final document deserves mention, a letter found among Moses Green's papers that appears never to have been sent. Addressed simply to "My dear children," the letter reads in part, "What I have created here, in this remote place, may never bear my name in the wider world. I have made peace with that possibility. But know this, your father was more than what they said he was, more than what they allowed him to be. I built something that helped a man walk again. Perhaps someday the world will be ready to acknowledge that such work could come from hands like mine. Until then, remember this truth, even if no one else does." For nearly a century, no one remembered. The legend of the beast flourished while the achievement of the man was buried. But eventually, slowly, the truth emerged from the silence of the mountains, from the yellowing pages of forgotten documents, from the gradual willingness of later generations to question established narratives and recognize overlooked contributions. Perhaps that is the final lesson of this disturbing case from the Ozark Mountains, that while truth can be buried, silenced, and distorted, it retains a capacity to eventually emerge if enough people care to uncover it. The horror lies not just in how easily Moses Green's story was transformed and his achievements erased, but in how many similar stories remain buried, waiting for someone to care enough to unearth them. In the Western Ozarks today, hikers occasionally report hearing something that sounds like tools working wood, especially in the vicinity of where the Hale property once stood. Park rangers attribute this to the natural sounds of the forest, branches creaking in the wind, woodpeckers drilling for insects. But for those familiar with the story of Moses Green, it's tempting to imagine something more. The echo of innovation continuing across time, of skilled hands working to create something that should have changed everything, and perhaps, eventually, still will.